Seems kind of bizarre to be standing up here giving an update on a piece of legislation that comes into force on Friday. Now, you'd think we might actually know what the legislation was by now. Okay, regulators have been quite busy since the last update, but there are still some gaps. New stuff we've got, both of these I think I discussed last time. The Article 29 Working Party has finalised their guidance. I think this is on consent and their guidance on transparency. The latter might help you if you want to write privacy notices, might not. The former should make you think whenever anybody says, I am doing this by consent. Have a quick look through that and you'll be well primed to tell them, no, you're not. All of those emails that we're all getting saying, please reconsent our mailing list. Now, if it was consent in the first place, it was almost certainly good consent. If it wasn't consent in the first place, it isn't now. It's a bit hard to keep up with what the ICO is doing because they don't seem to be publishing standalone documents anymore. Everything's just being rolled into their GDPR guidance pages. So apologies if I've missed anything here. The guidance on children was consulted on a while back. That does have a specific point relevant to this audience if you are offering information society services, so web stuff rather than network stuff. If you're offering that, processing data based on consent, and see previous comment on how little you should be using consent. They seem to offer two choices. One is that you make reasonable efforts to determine when a user is a child and then contact the parent by some protocol that hasn't yet passed the IETF. Or you make some steps to try and exclude children from accessing the service, or at least from accessing the parts of the service that require consent. I would take this as really strong guidance of don't try to avoid using consent when you are offering web services. Because if there are children around, both of these options look quite ugly. It does say reasonable efforts, and they do say reasonable based on what is the child's, or what is the information you're collecting. So sign up here to receive an email newsletter, you probably get away with. Sign up here to receive an email newsletter, and by the way, we'll sell your data to other marketers. I don't think you're going to get away with. There's an interesting one on what has been my favourite legal justification for processing for a long time, which is legitimate interests. For a while, or for many years actually, since '98 when the UK law came in, this has kind of been a bête noire of privacy people who go, oh, it's the organisation or the data controller making its own decision about what a legitimate interest. It isn't. There's a lot of controls in there if regulators cared to enforce them. And given that the ICO is now pushing legitimate interests, particularly as somewhere to move to if you're currently using consent, I think this one is well worth a look. The ICO is saying that legitimate interest is about the change from saying, hello data subject, here's what we're doing, your choice, to the organisation saying, actually, we've thought about the privacy implications of this, we've applied appropriate controls, and we think the risk is acceptable. So it is a change of where the responsibility is. That's something that's very much a theme of GDPR, where it's called the accountability principle. So if you look at any of your notices or anything, it says you consent to, think carefully, is it really consent? The ICO has said normally you are not allowed to change your basis for processing because that demonstrates that you were wrong in the first place. But as a special one-time opportunity, you might conclude that consent, old-style consent, is no longer appropriate under the GDPR, and you might look at a new basis, and the ICO won't stare too hard at you for that. So have a look at that one. There's some stuff on records of processing, which is a requirement. We're all supposed to keep records of the personal data we process. I confess I'm still struggling to work out how this differs from the sort of description of processing that we're also required to generate. But there is some stuff there which we will probably be staring at over the summer. And then, much to my surprise, I'd almost forgotten the ICO, last January, I think, January 2017, did a consultation on a document on consent, which then disappeared. And there was a little notice that said we're not going to publish anything on this until the Article 29s have published. The Article 29s have published, and the ICO document on consent. Now, one of the key changes in the GDPR, that document was published last week. I was in the States, so I only had a chance to give it a quick skim. Again, it looks to be trying very hard to narrow the uses of consent and say, really, consent is about your relationship with the individual. It's not a tick box, but it's about actually we want to encourage people to give us additional data that we don't need. It's about changing the relationship, which was actually the headline of their consultation from, 18 months ago. One, I confess I hadn't spotted, apologies. Back in 2016, now given there's been quite a lot of scaremongering, I think, under GDPR, about 20 million euro fines unless you buy our product. One of the things you can get fined for under GDPR is not notifying privacy breach, information security breaches. And I spotted that back in 2016, EE were fined £1,000. Now, that feels like a token to me. For late notification, they did notify, but the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations require you to notify within 24 hours. EE, I think it was about 3 or 4, and they got fined. And I looked at this is a bit weird. What more damage was going to be done in that additional time? And I wonder whether this is a hint, or this was a hint from the ICO, that notice there is a breach notification for everybody under GDPR, and we may be looking at enforcing this. So that one was interesting. So apologies I didn't pick it up at the time. Still missing I think, unless the ICO are claiming that what is now on their website is all they're going to say about data processor contracts. Again, kind of an important part of the regulation. They consulted on it last year. As far as I know, there's still been no publication following that consultation. And when I did these slides, I said that the guidance on data protection impact assessments hadn't been published. Actually, it was published last week. Those you are supposed to be starting on for any new processing after Friday. So, have a look at it, at least to consider whether you're processing any new activities need a DPIA. Stage 1 is decide whether we need a DPIA. Right, this is where it gets very depressing. Legislative progress. Like I said, we have a European law that comes into force on Friday. In that law, about 80 things are devolved to member states. So member states must regulate in certain areas. UK has a data protection bill. It finished the House of Lords, I think it was the 18th of January. Sorry, I looked up, I should have put it on the slide. It then came to the House of Commons. The committee stage finished just before Easter. The Commons finished their consideration about a month ago. And even though the deadline for this to be enforced is Friday, the Commons and the Lords have been kicking it to and fro for at least a week, in a process that is officially called ping-pong. I assumed that ping-pong was a slang word, but no, if you look on parliament.uk, the official status of the Data Protection Bill is in ping-pong. and further rounds of ping-pong will be taking place this evening. The main hang-up, or point of difference, seems to be Leveson 2. If you remember the Leveson inquiry, there was a recommendation, which the government of the time accepted, that there should be a second inquiry after the criminal cases to look in detail at breaches of data protection by journalists. And the House of Lords want to write into the Data Protection Act that this will actually happen. The House of Commons wants to write it out again. So I don't know if we're going to have a data protection bill on Friday. The weird thing, it struck me, is that one of the kinds of one of the jobs that will suffer if the UK does not legislate in those 80 areas is journalism. Because one of the things that is devolved to member states is set out your national rules for the balance between free speech and data protection. GDPR by default sets it very much at the data protection end. So if this isn't passed some point this week, journalists will suddenly be on the hook for a lot of currently lawful practices which will become unlawful until this is passed. Same could actually happen to academic researchers, so with a parochial hat on, I hope they do get something passed. But this is just farcical. This is something that should have been in. Well, something else that's in there is the data protection powers of the police. Not important, but hey, they only need a week to sort it out. The other thing which doesn't have a deadline, well, it did. Originally, the European Commission decided that alongside the GDPR coming into force this Friday, there would be an e-privacy regulation, which definitely does matter to us because this is what GDPR means for network providers. Commission published its draft last January. European Parliament got on with it over the summer. They decided, I think it was November, that it needed 168 amendments. Most of them pushing towards the privacy side, but they do explicitly say security is a good thing and you should be allowed to process personal data to secure networks. The European system has two joint legislators, the European Parliament and the European Council. The European Council are still struggling with big areas. I was looking at their latest draft on the plane back on Friday, and have you ever been asked to write a proposal and you send it in and it comes back with, no, you need to say more about this bit, so you put in more about this and you send it back again and they say, nah, that's distracting from the rest, so you take it out again. This draft is starting to look very much like that. Stuff is being put in at one meeting and taken out again at the next. And I do wonder if they're making any progress at all. Some of the things they're struggling with, the Commission draft put big duties on web browsers. Web browsers were going to have to get consent from everybody. Various people have said, well, who are you actually trying to regulate here? And the Council are struggling with that. They've come up with this phrase that it's anybody who places the browser software on the market will be regulated. Huh? Who places browser software on the market? We download it, we install it. They are struggling with cookies. The Commission were fairly tough on cookies. The Parliament are very tough on cookies. The Council want to be nice to cookies, but they can't work out how nice. Beacons, if you're doing location tracking. So, if you're looking at these little Bluetooth beeps that are moving around the room, the Commission and the Parliament think that's really, really bad and you shouldn't be able to do it without consent. The Council, I think, gets stuck in airport queues. And they really like those signs that say, time to get through security less than 5 minutes, which is done by looking at Bluetooth and Wi-Fi devices moving through the security check. And the Council, I think, would really like not to make that unlawful. But they're struggling, and their draft of what is supposed to be a technology-neutral document is actually laughable in its precision. Advertising, should it be allowed or not allowed? Does advertising that appears on the web page count? That's something that's been in and out of the draft. Now, they're fairly sure that sending you an email advert should be regulated. If you're looking at a web page and the advert just appears, not sure. The council work programme for the second half of this year certainly contains this. I'm now seeing suggestions that it might not be enforced till after March 2019. That raises the further confusion that it then gets tangled up with Brexit. Because if it isn't enforced by the 20th of March, to me it's extremely unclear whether it will come into force in the UK at all, whether it will be automatically picked up by by the leaving the EU bill or not. I did have somebody contact me last week to say, could I provide guidance on cookies? I'm afraid I said no, because I reckon there's at least 3 cookie regimes coming in the UK in the next year and maybe more. So that's a mess. One thing that is settled, I know it isn't GDPR, but I've mentioned it before, in force 10th of May, 10 days ago, I think, 11 days ago, the NIS directive was transposed by the deadline, amazingly. I didn't expect this to happen. So if you are a TLD registry handling more than 2 billion queries a day, if you're a DNS resolver handling more than 2 million clients a day, or a DNS name server handling more than 250,000 subdomains, or an IXP with more than 50% market share or roots, and I asked LINX people to explain that one to me last time, so I checked with them, then you are now covered by the Network and Information Systems Regulations. There should be a 2018 in there. So that is now exists. Your regulator is Ofcom, and your reporting will go to NCSC if you have any breaches. So worth a look at that. If you are what's called a digital service provider, so an online marketplace, an online search engine, or a cloud, which is defined in a very vague way, then your regulator is the ICO, and the requirements are set not nationally but by the European Union. The thresholds they've come up is that you have to report incidents if they cause an outage of more than 5 million user hours, or affect more than 100,000 users, or cause or risk €1 million in damage, or risk loss of life. And again, there the legislation now exists. It's this Commission Implementing Regulation 2018-151. So there is, for those sectors, there is actually now concrete stuff to work on. I'm hoping that's the last GDPR update. Because, hey, it finishes on Saturday, doesn't it? No. There are, I can't read them on here, you can't read them up there, but the slides are available. So that's what the links are for. So any questions, and please make them easy, because I only got back from San Francisco on Saturday, and the statements about day 2 of jet lag being worse than day 1 are spot on. Hooray, they're all more asleep than I am, which is going some.
Thank you.